part of this, of course, is because Americans in general, all Americans, have a special relationship with the Bible, and the Hebrew Bible is always important. But it's sort of this double messaging that goes on, to use a sort of goofy metaphor, but I think it pertains. Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s, you'd have this double messaging going on. Cartoons would insert Yiddish. This would be heard by the American audience as gibberish, but those who understood it would laugh, right? So the Three Stooges, their funny language is Yiddish, but the immigrants who understood Yiddish would hear it and know what they were saying. Mm-hmm. The others, it would just sounded funny. Double messaging. That's, in a way, what was going on with Lincoln. Participating in what everybody else was doing, but bringing him close in this way. I wanted to ask a question about pictures, if I could.
Before you go to that, I just want to finish up
sure.
Since I brought up a phrase, Lamed Vav.
Oh, yes.
Lamed and Vav in the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, are two letters, and their mathematical annotations are 36.
Right.
So the thought is in Judaica is that the world is not destroyed because of 36 righteous people.
Right.
They don't know whom they are, in fact, throughout the world. And as long as those 36 are there, then the world will not be destroyed.
Right.
And if one dies, another one is already appointed.
Right. That's right.
So I was wondering if Lincoln was ever placed onto that Lamed Vav. Here in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, certainly he is. And if the bookshop ever goes down, watch out the rest of the world.
Right.
I myself have never actually seen him identified as one of the 36. This is a Talmudic legend that goes back to the ancient rabbis, and you're absolutely right, Dan. I'm very impressed by your knowledge of Talmudic lore. But as you know from the book, he is referred to in the 20th century by Jews as a tzaddik, using that actual terminology. Right. And another interesting, remarkable phenomenon to me is, and I again, there's all this evidence in here. No other American figure, non-Jewish, is actually used as a teaching tool for becoming Jewish. He becomes a figure in religious school books. He's used as a sort of as a moral compass. Again and again in the 20th century in particular, you see Jews arguing that Lincoln teaches us to be better Jews. It's not just only about being Americans, which is a big part of it's also, we can be better American Jews, and that means connecting to our Jewish heritage if we behave like Abraham Lincoln. And I try to show that in the book through evidence. It's to me, it's completely unique.
Yeah, I thought so too, and that's why it's a riveting book in that regard. By the way, that book is not only just a history of the relationship of Lincoln and Jews in this country, but there's also documentary material in here that is really fascinating. So as you're reading along about the history of this, you're also then going to be able to read the letters pertinent to that material that Gary is pointing out, and it's fabulous. Some of that is just really things I've not seen before, kind of unique items and stories that are really fabulous. Others are very well known.
Well, the discussion you were just having about the campaign books, where you were saying how in 1864 what was a campaign book is quickly switched over into a memorial. Well, you may recall, Dan, there's one item that reminded me of that in here where right after the war, I'm convinced there was a Hebrew acrostic written in the Hebrew by an American Jew praising Lincoln. And if you read the text, you see that it's all about Lincoln's alive still, and it's all about the victory he just had in the war. And it must have been written maybe in March or something of that sort. And it's sent to 2 newspapers, and it's not published. But after his death, it becomes, if you will, a memorial prayer, and it appears. And so it reminded me of what we were talking about. It suddenly becomes used in a different way, this Hebrew prayer, if you will.
I'm learning a lot from you, Gary. No, really, this is an aspect of
Well,
Lincoln that I wasn't aware of.
And most aren't, and that's
yeah,
why this is an important
that's-
book for everyone
yeah.
to really
Yeah.
read, because there's a lot more in it than I had thought about the connections, and we'll get to a couple of those as well. I want to ask you, Tom, the campaign biographies, which of them, the 1860 campaign especially, were, first of all, why were there so many for Lincoln and not for his rivals? Bell and Breckinridge and Douglas, many fewer. They were well known, of course. Lincoln was not. Is that
Right.
the cause?
Well, that's part of it, but I think you must remember there's two forces here in terms of who's producing these campaign biographies. There is the party who is behind some of the campaign biographies, but most of the campaign biographies are being produced by commercial firms. Commercial firms, their agenda is not just to promote the candidacy, and they're more concerned about profit, selling books. Politics was very much a popular thing with Americans in the 19th century. Politics, in some cases, was the only game in town. This is when people would stand for hours listening to a political speech, would travel miles to hear a political speech or a debate. So commercial firms picked up, I believe, and this is my argument, on the enthusiasm generated by this very evocative image of Lincoln, Honest Abe, the rail splitter. And I believe they thought, hey, we're really onto something here. And there was great interest among commercial firms to get out in front of this and competed with each other to produce campaign biographies. So that's what my argument is.
Now, from the 60 to the 64 campaign, different issues arose.
That's right.
And they used the symbolism differently. For instance,
That's right.
the 64 campaign didn't really talk about Republicans, they talked about Union.
That's right.
It's a Union party, not the Republican Party.
That's right.
How did they change Lincoln's image from 60 to 64 to keep him into a second term?
Well, of course, as you mentioned, the circumstances are very dramatically different. They're dramatically different in 1864. For one thing, Lincoln is no longer an unknown candidate. He's been president for 4 years. He has a record. Most people know who he is. But, okay, so when some of these campaign biographies were produced, it was in a period before the nomination, or certainly when things were looking very bleak for the Republican Party. They could no longer just fall back on Honest Abe, the rail splitter image. They had to do something a little differently. And so they didn't dispense with that image or that message. They built upon it. So in other words, what made Lincoln a successful president is his background,
His character.
the character that was built on the frontier out west through hard work, through diligence, through an innate intellect. And so that gets him that's what's gotten him through the presidency. But he has become this trusted figure, this father figure, particularly to the Union soldiers who idolized Lincoln and referred to him as Father Abraham. So in a sense, you're building on this popular image, but the popular image is not enough in terms of the campaign biographers. You got to do something a little more, and it's this figure that we've trusted who has gotten us this far. And if we just sort of, depend on his leadership, he will get us through.
Now, you mentioned in the book how Breckinridge and Bell, it was different, their campaign biographies were a bit different than the Western men, Douglas and Lincoln, whereas they were the professionals, this is whom you had seen before. Douglas and Lincoln, they were telling a great deal of anecdotes and stories, and producing a different sort of image for the two of them. Fascinating that you were talking about that. I was wondering, because they're Western men, the Midwest is a little different than the East, for instance, in its ethos, and it's more open, so maybe that's why.
Well, and they had similar backgrounds. They both came from poor upbringing, and Douglas, for his early career, bounced around. He was a teacher and a lawyer before he made it actually big. Also in some ways self-educated, though not as much as Lincoln. So there were the similar and stories, and also Douglas presented himself as a fighter, as a battler, and of course he became a great orator like Lincoln, and of course was very small in stature, unlike Lincoln, and of course so he was the little giant, and that was sort of his image of the little guy battling for the other little guy, so to speak.
What about then in '64? They still were giving anecdotes, and he was still a bit of the joker, I believe, humorous and for the point, of course, to tell the point. That's Lincoln. But did McClellan learn anything? Are they going to say he was slow?
No, the interesting thing about the McClellan campaign biographies is they're mostly a defense of McClellan, a defense of what has been alleged by certainly the Republicans as a failed generalship, that the war could have been ended sooner if McClellan had been more of an effective and competent general. And so the main message that the McClellan biographers want to get out there is that this man's reputation has been wronged. He's been wronged by Lincoln. He's been wronged by Republicans. That if he was only given the chance, that he would have prevailed, and that Lincoln was, a despot, a tyrant, and was pressured by the radicals to get rid of this very competent general. And of course, they also make sure that the readers know that McClellan was a gentleman, that he did not believe in hard war, that he respected the property, including slaves, of the Confederates, whereas Lincoln, of course, was pushing this hard war. And of course, by the 1864 campaign, Grant is the general, and of course there has been many casualties under Grant, a lot of destruction under Sherman, and so they're comparing this gentleman who will end the war in an honorable way, as opposed to this hard war of the Republican Party, which is out to destroy the nation, where McClellan will reunite the nation.